Smith. Now, for those new guests here and returning guests, Lloyd is one of our more accomplished speakers. He's an award winner at our local competitions, and his speeches are wonderful. And I really believe that you'll enjoy the speech that he's about to give. Now, he has chosen a speech that's called No-Go Zones. And he says that Mark Twain once famously said, "Ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." He was right about that, and he'd be shocked to see how much we know that just ain't so. Today, thanks to the internet and 24-hour news cycle, the Project 4, a fact-finding report from the Advanced Communicator Series manual, Speaking to Inform, Lloyd Smith will examine a recent example of something that just ain't so, and explain how so many people know it. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Lloyd Smith and his
Have you heard about all of the areas in Europe and even here in the United States that are controlled by fundamentalist Islamists where non-Muslims are not even allowed to go? Some of you look kind of puzzled, and that's okay because they're not real, unless you listen to some certain cable news channels and follow some internet sites. After the attacks in Paris of 2 or 3 weeks ago, where those 3 Islamist thugs killed about 20 people almost, the news started coming out that there were places in Europe, entire cities, that are controlled by these Muslim fundamentalists where non-Muslims are not allowed to go. Birmingham, England was one of them. But here in the United States, supposedly Dearborn, Michigan is one of them. That's a city of 250,000 people, by the way. Big areas of Boca Raton, Florida. So if your grandpa has retired there, tell him to be cautious on the golf course. And of course, the suburbs of Seattle, which are fundamentalist Muslim hotbeds with Algerian terrorist training camps. Now, that last one may be a tip-off of what is going on, namely nothing. Typically, when these rumors and whatnot start, it's very difficult to understand where they came from. But this one is unusual because it is possible to follow it to its source. The source turns out to be a guy you may not have heard of, but I hope you have, Bobby Jindal, who was the governor of Louisiana. Now, Governor Jindal is not a nutcase. He's a very serious-minded guy who's been talked about a lot as potential Republican candidate for president. He gave a speech about, I think, 10 days ago or so now, where he mentioned this notion that there were places where non-Muslims are not allowed to go and Sharia law is in effect. When he was asked what his source was, his press secretary replied that it was various printed and broadcast journalism. Well, it turns out that what he was referring to was an expert that Fox News hired to talk about the attacks in Paris, a guy named Steve Emerson. This guy has been on Fox News quite a bit, and he's a legit expert in Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. He actually served as an advisor to a guy named Richard Clark, who was the, not national security advisor, some kind of a terrorism advisor to both President Bill Clinton and President George W. Bush. And Clark is no fool. He understands this kind of thing. Emerson is the author of a book called American Jihad that was published in 2001. The thesis behind American Jihad is that Muslims are inherently dangerous, and there's a very large danger that they're going to overwhelm the Western democracies in Europe and here in the United States. Now, this raises a question that actually confuses a lot of people. How many Muslims are there in the United States? Could they actually overwhelm the country? Turns out the Harris polling people looked into this about a year ago and asked a sample of the US population, what percentage of Americans are Muslim? It turns out that the average American thinks that 22% of the American population is Muslim. The reality is a little different from that. Muslims are actually the third largest religious denomination in the US after Christians and Jews, but they account for 0.6%, 0.6% of the American population. Now that's a large number of people, but not a large percentage of people at all. It would be very surprising if 0.6% of the American people could somehow overwhelm the entire rest of the population. Emerson is famous too for arguing that the Boston Marathon bombing was actually the work of Saudi Arabian terrorists who were then spirited out of the country the next morning. Of course, it turned out there were other guys who did it. One of them is now on trial in Boston. There are numerous things that are difficult to know about him. He claims he was in the FBI witness protection program, but was kicked out because it was too dangerous for the FBI to guard him against the terrorists, and so on. Now the thing is, after Emerson talked on Fox News about these areas, including Dearborn, Michigan, where non-Muslims are not allowed to go, a couple days later, Fox News retracted his story, and Emerson himself apologized. That's a very unusual thing. Fox News generally does not retract its stories. When they're attacked on credibility grounds, they typically argue that liberals are trying to suppress them. And when Fox retracted it, that's a pretty good sign that it didn't exist. But by then, it had taken on a life of its own. Various blogs and websites began reporting Emerson's story back, and Emerson quoted them. You see what I'm getting at here? This got circular. Emerson was the source of this. Some other sites and broadcasts picked up the story, and then Emerson quoted them as supporting him. There's a map that I wish I had made a large copy of, but it wouldn't print well because of the way the graphic was created online, that shows all of these terrorist websites, supposedly, including the ones in Seattle. It's Algerian terrorists, by the way, that control Seattle and won't let us non-Muslims in. But anyway, the little tiny print at the bottom of the map, it says, source, various remarks by Steve Emerson. That's not exactly the way most of us were taught to do research papers when we were in school, is it? Now, what this amounts to is that we have here a kind of a hall of mirrors. One guy said something that another guy said that is based on something, and as it becomes quoted, everybody starts quoting one another as if it were all true. Nobody has paused to say, wait a minute here, where's the original source of this? And the original source of it almost doesn't exist. It's become a spiral now. As you may suspect, some over-fevered conspiracy theorists are arguing that it's actually President Obama's fault. See, since he's a Muslim, he has ordered the FBI and Homeland Security not to look into these terrorist enclaves. And that's why we don't hear about them in the mainstream media. What does this amount to? Well, when you hear something like that, like an entire city like Dearborn, Michigan, is subject to Sharia law, you got to think, does that sound reasonable? And the answer is no, it does not. Now, if there are any questions, I'm happy to try to pretend to answer them. Yes, sir.
For your next speech,
Pardon me.
For your next speech, can you see if Korea really did hack something?
Yeah, that's a weird and interesting story. A lot of computer experts say no, it probably did not. They think it sounds more like maybe disgruntled former Sony employees or something. I don't know enough about computer security to know, but it is kind of a weird one.
Lloyd?
Yes, Joe.
If you decide to redo this exact speech again, could you maybe consider doing a story on Deflategate?
Joe.
Deflating footballs. Tom Brady says, well, I don't know, I'm not sure what a football feels like.
Won 3 Super Bowls.
Yeah, that guy, talk about a world expert.
A lot of credibility
what football
there.
should feel like. Yeah, Steve.
I was just wondering if you thought North Korea really hacked into Sony's.
I don't know, I've heard about that though.
Yeah.
You might want to talk to Eric after the meeting. Yes, Christina.
How do you recommend that people check into things they hear to
Well,
see if they're credible or not?
Back when I was a college debater, we were always taught, apply 3 tests to everything you hear. Says who, when, and so what. And the says who is, did the person who said it, does he have expertise? The when is it current, has it been superseded by newer information? And the so what is, does it have any impact? Now, that's the test that this fails for me. I don't know enough about Mr. Emerson to know whether he's a credible expert or not. I have some doubts based on some of the things I read about him, but I don't know. The when was current, but the so what, it just doesn't ring correctly. I mean, Dearborn, Michigan has about 250,000 people in it. The idea that a city that size could be taken over by these alleged fundamentalists who impose a different legal system on them, and somehow regular people just haven't heard about that, it just doesn't ring right. Let's face it. Yes, Jack?
But I didn't hear any of this no-go zone about in the United States, but I've heard it referred
In
to
Europe.
in France
Yeah.
and in England, and that they do have a big problem. And I think I heard Cameron, the Prime Minister, referring to no-go zones.
Yeah, actually, Prime Minister Cameron, when he heard about Mr. Emerson's claim that Birmingham, England was a no-go zone, his quotation's kind of humorous. He said, "I almost choked on my morning porridge." Man's obviously a blithering idiot. Birmingham, England is about 30% Muslim right now. But the notion that there's a no-go zone is just not true. What there are neighborhoods of Muslims, and there are some people in those neighborhoods who have a kind of a, I guess you'd call it a street vigilante thing. They're trying to, like they harass bar owners, for example. They don't want liquor served in there. They don't like gambling and that sort of thing. But this isn't the same as saying Sharia law has been imposed. Sharia law is a formal system. Well, not quite by a big margin. I mean, it's not quite as in it's not true. You know, I mean, when you get down to it, Sharia law is a formal system.
Yes.
It either is there or it's not there, and it's not there. There's regular British law in Birmingham. Yes.
Lloyd, I think it may be fair to say that in the United States, precedence has been set to a moderate degree regarding a group taking over an area, such as gang territories in our country, in the bigger cities in New York, et cetera. So the idea of there being a separate government or something like that that could exist in our country to some moderate or larger degree does have precedence. I'm not arguing that this news information that you gave us is accurate. I'm just saying that it has been tolerated to some degree in the United States through gangs, as
I'm not sure that analogy is a great one, because the notion is that the Sharia law system has replaced regular domestic American law. That's just flatly not the case.
Sure, right.
You know, the gang thing is more like a takeover. You know, that the police can push back against. I'm not. Those don't strike me as analogies to one another. And we are out of time. So.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, yes.